everybody, it's Steve Matthews. Thanks for joining me for episode 9 of our walk through Dr. John Robins' book, Ecclesiastical Megalomania. Today we're going to be taking a look at chapter 4, and chapter 4 of the book is titled Subsequent Encyclicals. So it's been a while since I've done this, so it's great to be back in the seat doing some videos here again. Here's the book. Just to let you know, here's a copy of the book. It's Ecclesiastical Megalomania. That's what we'll be going through. And as I said, today we're going to be taking a look at chapter 4. Now, chapter 4 is titled Subsequent Encyclicals. All right, so if we talk about something that says subsequent encyclicals, that must mean that there was a prior encyclical. And of course, that's true. And in chapter 3 of the book, and this was the last episode we did, this is episode number 8. In chapter 3, we took a look at a really seminal papal encyclical titled Rerum Novarum on the condition of the working class. And it was a very famous encyclical. It was written in 1891 by Pope Leo XIII. And we talked in there about how that encyclical was very socialist in its cast. It was, in fact, John Robins even described the book as described the encyclical as saying parts of it could have been written by Karl Marx. It was so socialist, even communist in some of its language. This chapter, in chapter 4, we're going to be dealing with subsequent encyclicals. So what these are encyclicals that are written by popes that came after Pope Leo XIII. Basically, popes who came along in the ensuing time after 1891, who wrote encyclicals that built on and referred back to Rerum Novarum. So a few things here maybe before we jump into it. One of the things I wanted to mention here is just discuss what's an encyclical. Maybe we talked about that last time, but I thought I'd go over that again. There are a few definitions of encyclicals. Now, an encyclical it's just basically a circular letter that's written by a pope. But maybe to be a little bit more formal about it, this is from Encyclopedia Britannica. An encyclical is a pastoral letter written by the Pope for the whole Roman Catholic Church on matters of doctrine, morals, or discipline. Now, the website Papal Encyclicals Online gives this definition. A papal encyclical is the name typically given to a letter written by a pope to a particular audience of bishops. This audience of bishops may be all of the bishops in a specific country or all of the bishops in all countries throughout the world. Finally, Merriam-Webster gives a definition of a papal encyclical as a papal letter to the bishops of the church as a whole or to those in one country. So basically, again, you just kind of summarize all that. It's a letter written by the Pope, and it's addressed to the bishops of the Roman Catholic Church. It's not addressed to the people of the Roman Catholic Church. It's addressed to the bishops of the Roman Catholic Church. And it can cover matters of doctrine, morals, or discipline, according to the Encyclopedia Britannica. So what we're going to do here is we're going to talk in this particular chapter, as I said, about certain encyclicals that were built on top of some of the ideas that were put forward by Leo XIII in his encyclical Rerum Novarum. The first encyclical we're going to talk about is one that was written by John Paul II. Now, John Paul II, some of you may remember, remember his papacy. I mean, he became Pope, I think it was in 1979. I mean, I remember when that happened, and of course, he was Pope throughout a pretty good chunk of my life. And he had a fairly long pontificate. I think it was over 20 years. I don't remember the exact year when he died, but I know it was at least 20 years, probably longer than that. But this is a particular encyclical that was written by John Paul II called Laborem Exercens, and it was written in 1981. Now, it's kind of interesting, that particular date. I mentioned that Rerum Novarum on the condition of the working class. That was written in 1891. One of the things you notice about encyclicals that are built on Rerum Novarum is very often, not always, but very often, they're written on 10-year anniversaries of Rerum Novarum. So this particular encyclical was written on the 90th anniversary of Rerum Novarum. I'm just going to read a couple paragraphs here, and we'll comment on it some. This is right from the beginning. This is on page 60 in my edition of Ecclesiastical Megalomania. After Leo XIII, other popes, including John Paul II, have repeatedly endorsed Rerum Novarum. We have already heard from Pius XI. John Paul II wrote in his encyclical Laborum Exercens, 1981. This question and the problems connected with it gave rise to a just social reaction and caused the impetuous emergence of a great burst of solidarity between workers, first and foremost industrial workers. The call to solidarity and common action addressed to workers, especially to those engaged in narrowly specialized, monotonous, and depersonalized work in industrialized plants, when the machine tends to dominate man, was important and eloquent from the point of view of social ethics. It was the reaction against the degradation of man as the subject of work and against the unheard of accompanying exploitation in the field of wages, working conditions, and social security for the worker. Okay, so that's the end of the quote there from John Paul II's encyclical Laborum Exercens. John Robbins makes a comment on it. He says, John Paul II not only accepted a Marxist analysis of industrial work, you can tell that he accepted a Marxist analysis of it because he talked about industrial work as an exploitation or as being or of exploiting workers. That's one very common idea, common theme among Marxists. So John Paul II not only accepted a Marxist analysis of industrial work, which degrades and exploits man, but he specifically said the reaction against capitalism was just. He talked about it being a just social reaction. Now, one thing, and I think this is worth noting here, in a footnote, John Robbins makes this point. He says, we ought to keep in mind that John Paul II's observation of industrial work did not occur in a capitalist or even a semi-capitalist country. It occurred in communist Poland. You may recall John Paul II was actually from Poland. He was, I don't know if this is true or not, but I think he was the first non-Italian Pope, or if not the first non-Italian, he was maybe the first in a long time. I'd have to go back and double check that. But it was really surprising when one of the things when he was elected Pope is he was Polish. He wasn't Italian. That was a pretty big deal at the time. So here's John Paul II. He continues in his encyclical. I'm just going to read another paragraph here. Following the lines laid down by the encyclical Rerum Novarum, and to stop there for a moment, note well, John Paul II is referring back to Rerum Novarum, so that's one of the ways you know that Rerum Novarum is a very important encyclical, because a lot of subsequent popes, not just John Paul II, but a lot of subsequent popes refer back to it. So here we go. He's got an explicit reference to Rerum Novarum. So following the lines laid down by the encyclical Rerum Novarum and many later documents of the Church's magisterium, it must be frankly recognized that the reaction against a system of injustice and harm that cried to heaven for vengeance and that weighed heavily upon the workers in that period of rapid industrialization was justified from the point of view of social morality. This state of affairs was favored by the liberal socio-political system. Okay, so let's unpack that. I'm going to read John Robbins' comments on it because they're really good here, what he says. So this is what John Robbins says about that brief paragraph. In these words, John Paul II described capitalism as the system of injustice and harm that cried to heaven for vengeance. In addition to the falsity of his authoritative and allegedly infallible declarations, we must point out that John Paul II has not used such language in speaking of communism or socialism. So, many times you can find in different papal documents, including those of John Paul II, criticisms of communism, but you didn't get the kind of pointed denunciation as you do of capitalism. Again, remember, this is what John Paul II said about capitalism. He called it the system of injustice and harm that cried out to heaven for vengeance. Now, you might think that growing up in a communist country, in communist Poland, he might have been talking about communism, but he wasn't. He was talking about capitalism. He was talking about liberty. He was talking about free markets. He was talking about private property, a system of private property. That's what capitalism is. It's a system of private ownership of the means of production. But let's go back to John Robbins. This is what he says. Moreover, he, that is John Paul II, made it clear that he was attacking not only the economic system, but also the entire, quote, liberal socio-political system, end quote. It is not just capitalism that John Paul II condemned, but its political counterpart, a limited constitutional republic. Now, earlier in one of the earlier videos, I talked about this. John Robbins used, I thought, a really good term when he talked about the complex of limited government and capitalism. He called it constitutional capitalism. And that covers both the political side of things and the economic side of things. And it's the idea that limited government, limited constitutional government, and a system of private property, they go together. They fit together. And not only do they go together logically, both of them are biblical. So the idea of a limited constitutional republic, that is a biblical concept. The idea of a system of capitalism, of free markets, of private property, that is biblical economics. So you have biblical politics, limited constitutional government married with biblical economics, which is capitalism. Those two go together. And that's what John Robbins called he called it constitutional capitalism. Now, one thing that might throw some people sometimes, and this is what and this is actually using the language of Pope John Paul II, he called that system of constitutional capitalism, that economic and political system of the Bible. He called it the liberal socio-political system. Now, that confuses a lot of people, at least if you're an American, because in America, when we talk about liberalism, we're usually talking about, we mean socialism. We mean, say, like the Democrats, they want they want all these various social programs. They want free health care for everybody. They want free college for everybody. They want, free everything, and somehow that's supposed to get paid for. We won't go too far down that route, but I mean, that's what we mean by liberalism. You think of FDR's New Deal in the 1930s or Lyndon Johnson's Great Society in the 1960s. Both of those did a great deal to expand the socialism in the United States. And we call that liberalism here. Now, it's like I have a friend of mine who lives in Australia, and we talk about politics and the like, and he made the point to me, it's kind of interesting, he said there are two major political parties in Australia. You have the Labour Party, which corresponds to the Democrats, and then you have what's called the Liberal Party. Now, the Liberal Party corresponds to, in America, what we would call Republicans. They're supposedly, what we would call conservatives in Australia, they call that the Liberal Party. I don't know, maybe it's because they're on the other hemisphere or something, the southern hemisphere, northern hemisphere. Actually, no, it has nothing to do with that. What it has to do with, the term liberal in the 19th century meant limited government, somebody who believed in limited government and capitalism. And it means just the opposite of what it means today. So when the Australian Liberal Party actually has preserved that older use of that term. And that's the language that the Pope uses here. He's using liberal in that older sort of 19th century sense of the term. The liberal socio-political system that the Pope is criticizing. He's not criticizing the Democrats. What he's doing is he's criticizing people who believe in free markets and limited government. That's what he's criticizing here. Let's go back to John Robbins' comment on that again, because I think this is a really key point that he makes. So this is John Robbins commenting on the Pope. He says this: moreover, he, that is John Paul II, made it clear that he was attacking not only the economic system, but also the entire liberal socio-political system. It is not just capitalism that John Paul II condemned, but its political counterpart, a limited constitutional republic. So you can see that Pope John Paul II was hostile to the political and economic system of the United States, or at least the original political and economic system of the United States, and other Western countries that were influenced by the Protestant Reformation. So that's enough there about Laborem Exercens. There's another important encyclical that John Robbins cites that is also refers back to, is built on a lot of the ideas of found in Rerum Novarum. It was a 1967 encyclical called Populorum Progressio, on the progress of the peoples. It was issued in 1967. It was written by Pope Paul VI. I'm going to read a paragraph here out of that encyclical, and I'm also going to refer to John Robbins' comments. But it is unfortunate that on these new conditions of society, a system has been constructed which considers profit as the key motive for economic progress. Competition is the supreme law of economics, and private ownership as the means of production is an absolute right that has no limits and carries no corresponding social obligation. This unchecked liberalism, I'll stop right there. The unchecked liberalism, again, this is liberalism in the 19th century sense of the word, by which the Pope is criticizing people who believe in limited government and capitalism. Let's go back here. So picking back up with Pope Paul VI. This unchecked liberalism leads to dictatorship rightly denounced by Pius XI as producing the internal imperialism of money. One cannot condemn such abuses too strongly, but if it is true that a type of capitalism has been the source of excessive suffering, injustices, and fratricidal conflicts whose effects still persist, it would also be wrong to attribute to industrialization itself evils that belong to the woeful system which accompanied it. And commenting on this paragraph here, John Robbins says this: Paul VI wanted industrialization, but not capitalism. That is also what the Marxists want. He even denounced capitalism as a woeful system and a dictatorship, while rejecting on moral grounds profit-making, competition, and private ownership of the means of production. Commenting on the Populorum Progressio, Ayn Rand asked, if concern for human poverty and suffering were one's primary motive, one would seek to discover their cause. One would not fail to ask, why did some nations develop while others did not? Rand's modus tollens is conclusive. Concern for human poverty is not the Vatican's primary concern. The Roman Church state was in no position to ask any question about economic development, for its own teachings and hegemony were the cause of economic stagnation, poverty, and suffering. Where those teachings had been abandoned and its hegemony cast off, economies developed rapidly after more than a millennium of economic stagnation under its rule. Okay, so let's just unpack that a little bit. So you had Pope Paul VI talking about all of the suffering in that supposedly has been caused by capitalism. But he never seemed to ask that question, why did some nations develop and why others did not? I mean, for instance, let's compare, say, the United States, the developed economy of the United States, to the economies of South and Central America. Well, what has been the principal institution in the countries of South and Central America for the last 500 years? Well, it's the Roman Catholic Church state. That's what it is. And, those economies, by and large, remain fairly undeveloped, at least by comparison to the United States. And what you hear now, and this actually bears, I think, directly on some of the crisis going on with immigration. You have all these people flooding over the southern border, and of course Rome encourages them to flood in, and they use as an excuse for flooding the country with all these migrants, saying, well, these people don't have anything, and it's the obligation of the richer countries to take care of the poorer countries. But Rome never asked the question, how come these countries in South and Central America, after 500 years of being under the influence of the Roman Catholic Church state, how come they're still so poor? Well, I mean, the answer is, and this is the reason that Rome doesn't ask this question, this is the point John Robbins makes here, the reason Rome doesn't ask that question is because it's Rome's own theology and politics and economic philosophy that has caused the poverty, that has caused the instability that you see in those nations. Rome can't do anything to fix the problem without rejecting its own ideas, its own theology, its own philosophy. And so Rome will never ask that question. What they're trying to do is to make you hopefully not ask that question and then just try to get you to pay for the mess that it created. That's what's going on there. Here's something else interesting about Populorum Progressio. I'm going to read this here. This is, again, John Robbins. Populorum Progressio was such a strident attack on capitalism that the editorial staff of the Wall Street Journal made excuses for it. The journal declared, in effect, and this is the quote from the Wall Street Journal, the journal declared, in effect, that the Pope didn't mean it. Oh, excuse me, this isn't the journal he's quoting directly. This is actually Ayn Rand. This is Ayn Rand commenting on the Wall Street Journal. So the journal declared, in effect, that the Pope didn't mean it. The encyclical, it alleged, was just a misunderstanding caused by some mysterious conspiracy of Vatican translators who misinterpreted the Pope's ideas in transferring them from the original Latin into English. His Holiness may not be showering compliments on free market system, but he is not at all saying what the Vatican's English version appeared to make him say. So said the Wall Street Journal. And this is John Robbins. He picks up a comment on this. He says, unfortunately for the Wall Street Journal and all others who try to excuse the infallible Pope by saying he has incompetent translators, the Vatican has had over 30 years to correct the allegedly incorrect translation, but the encyclical still reads as it did in 1967. The Vatican means what it says, though it does not always say what it means. And this is one of the things that's interesting. I've read other commentators that say this as well. Whenever there's an encyclical that's released that may be shocking to some people or upsetting to some people, you will find people in the mainstream media trying to make excuses. They're trying to say, oh, no, the Pope really didn't say that. It's the translation. But somehow those translations are never changed, even though decades can go by. So I think we can dismiss the idea that it was the translators. And I think the Pope said exactly what he meant, just like what John Robbins said. There's no reason to try to soft pedal it, even though some people find the ideas that Pope Paul the Sixth set forth a bit embarrassing. And let's see here, what else do we have? Okay, here we go. There's another. Let's pick up. There's another encyclical that John Robbins talks about in here. And let me get to where I can find it here. Okay. So, yeah, he's talking here about, this is going back a bit, back into the 1930s. And let me read here a little bit, and then we'll comment on it. This is beginning on page 63 of Ecclesiastical Megalomania. Pius XI published his encyclical Divini Redemptoris on atheistic communism in 1937. In the course of that encyclical letter, he referred to the Roman Catholic employers and industrialists in Europe and North America who, quote, are saddled with the heavy heritage of an unjust economic regime whose ruinous influence has been felt throughout many generations, end quote. John Robbins continues. Now, one might think that the Pope was speaking of socialism or communism, especially since this was the subject of the encyclical. But the, quote, unjust economic regime, end quote, he was actually condemning was capitalism. And continues John Robbins. Apparently those same Roman Catholic businessmen had been so disturbed by his 1931 encyclical Quadragesimo Anno. Quadragesimo Anno, that means the 40th year, the 40th anniversary. So that was written in 1931. You remember what I said before about how a lot of times you will find encyclical letters referring to Rerum Novarum that are written on a 10-year anniversary. So Rerum Novarum was written in 1891, and so then you have on the 40th anniversary you have Pius XI writing another encyclical that's built upon that same encyclical Rerum Novarum. So it's the 40th anniversary of that encyclical that he wrote. The encyclical, that is, on the 40th anniversary of the publication of Rerum Novarum, Pope Pius XI wrote an encyclical called Quadragesimo Anno. And that's what John Robbins is referring to here. So let me go back here to John Robbins. This is what he says. Apparently those same Roman Catholic businessmen had been so disturbed by his, that is Pius XI's, encyclical Quadragesimo Anno, that they had succeeded in blocking its dissemination. The Pope asked, quote, what is to be thought of the action of those Catholic employers who in one place succeeded in preventing the reading of our encyclical Quadragesimo Anno on social reconstruction in their local churches? Of those Catholic industrialists who even to this day have shown themselves hostile to a labor movement that we ourselves recommended, end quote. And John Robbins picks up. He says this, one can only praise those Roman Catholic businessmen. If only they'd been as enlightened as Luther, they might have heated their factions by burning papal encyclicals in their furnaces. Of course, he's referring there to, I think it was what Martin Luther, he burned the papal bull, what was it, Arise, O Lord, Exurgens Domine, I think is the Latin title of it. But that was the excommunication of Martin Luther, and he famously burned the papal bull, excommunicating him. Well, there's a very important thing to note in here. And that is that there were, and Pope Pius the 11th complains about that in in one of his encyclicals. He's complaining that a prior encyclical, Quadragesimo Anno, that was very, very socialist, the distribution of that encyclical was blocked by Roman Catholic businessmen because they recognized how socialist it was. And John Robbins says, that these men should be praised for that. And of course, he's right about it. And I think there's something important to remember here. One of the things, of course, this book is sharply critical of the economics and politics of the Roman Catholic Church. I myself am very critical of the economics and politics and theology, as was John Robbins. He was also very critical of the theology of the Roman Catholic Church. But when we criticize the Roman Catholic Church, that's not to say that every single Roman Catholic necessarily subscribes to all of these doctrines. There are a lot of Roman Catholics who, like these businessmen, actually do have a great appreciation for limited government and for capitalism, for constitutional capitalism. They can see the justice in it, they can see the advantage in it, they can see the good things that flow from that. And even though their theology as Roman Catholics doesn't support that, they inconsistently still hold to doctrines of liberty. And that's a good thing. I mean, I'm glad that there are Roman Catholics who do not follow the Pope. Now, of course, we can pray, maybe that can be an opportunity to do some, say, evangelism. Because, if you talk to a Roman Catholic and say, hey, you like capitalism, you like limited government. Well, yeah. Well, do you know these ideas come from the Bible? And do you know that your church, the Roman Catholic Church, is hostile to these ideas? And that's an opportunity that as Christians we have to talk to Roman Catholics. And I want to refer back to something. This is something that John Robbins wrote earlier in the book. It's actually in the introduction, and this is on page 25. And I'm going to refer back to this. This is what John Robbins said. And if there be any Roman Catholic readers who incline to favor freedom and free enterprise, may they understand that their church does not, and therefore they must choose to be either good Catholics or good Christians. So, if a Roman Catholic loves, say, capitalism and limited government, well, what he should do is he should follow Christ. You should believe the gospel of Jesus Christ, because the system of constitutional capitalism is one of the implications of the preaching of the gospel of justification by belief alone. That's one of the great blessings that comes out of that. If the Son of Man sets you free, you shall be free indeed. Well, Jesus was talking there, of course, principally that was spiritual, but spiritual liberty always precedes political and economic liberty. You see this in the Old Testament, and it's also true today. Well, there's a few other things in there, but I think we're coming up on about half an hour. I think that's enough. That's I think, a pretty good overview of Ecclesiastical Megalomania, Chapter 4. Thanks for staying with me. I really appreciate that. I hope you got something out of this. Please feel free to like and comment this video. It'd be great to have you do that. And if you do have any questions, feel free to let me know. Until next time, this is Steve Matthews.